School of Social Work, I teach a couple of courses. I teach research methods too, and I also teach human behavior. And the interesting part about my work in terms of being in social work is the opportunity to make a bridge between social work and athletics. You may be asking yourself, what does social work have to do with athletics? And when you think about some of the issues that Dr. Shropshire talked about in terms of Pac-Man Jones or the Cincinnati Bengals or the old UNLV Running Rebels, when you think about substance use, when you think about domestic violence, when you think about race and gender issues, when you think about oppression, those are issues that we traditionally address.
This area, why is it?
I would like to talk about the notion of social justice. As I understand it, social justice is a large part of the legal education. And so what I propose to do is talk from about 5 or 6 points with regard to the notion of social justice as it pertains to increasing the number of black coaches in Division I sports. The president of the Black Coaches Association Administrators, Coach Floyd Keith, oftentimes when he describes the inequities that are involved in college coaching, he uses the term social justice. And by social justice, or in this case, social injustice, Coach Keith is simply referring to the fact that we have 55% of the players are minority, roughly 49.4% are African American, yet we only have 5 black coaches. That's what we would label a social injustice. Now, being a methodologist as well as a teacher of human behavior, I had to make sure that the information that I spoke to you this evening had some type of foundation in the literature. So theoretically speaking, I tapped the work of Novak in defining social justice. And Novak simply says that social justice is ideologically neutral, and that it consists of various activities, including athletics. Legally speaking, the work of Mathewson in his work Function at the Junction, he talks about this notion of equality and equity as it pertains to black female student athletes in the prep sports. And Mathewson's piece is important because in this piece, he gives us a sense of equality versus equity. Michael mentioned it earlier. Are we seeking equality? Is it realistic for us to think that 55% of the coaches in Division I sports are going to be black? This discussion, I found a piece of work by Rand, and it's called Teaching Law Students to Practice Social Justice. And Rand, a lawyer by practice, points out that the social work profession, that's us, provides some nice operational definitions for practicing social justice. I'm certainly guilty of it in terms of being a social worker. I have this notion of social justice, what it's supposed to look like, what it's supposed to smell like, what it's supposed to feel like. But in Rand's work, he provides some nice operational definitions based on the principles of social work education that allow lawyers to frame their work as it pertains to social justice. Just a couple of statistics to revisit the issue. 414 openings since 1982, 21 black coaches hired. As my colleague cited, 176 openings since 1996, 11 black coaches hired. In the history of college football, a total of 22 black coaches have been hired. So if we look at Rawls' definition of social justice, Rawls simply refers to social justice as fairness. These statistics seem unfair to me. Schramm, who also writes on social justice, asserts that social justice cannot be legislated by some founding ethic. Schramm, who also writes on social justice, asserts that social justice cannot be legislated by some founding ethic that specifies the right normative standard that we should adhere to. So he's speaking directly to this notion of Title VII. What he's saying is that we can't legislate morality. My colleague spoke earlier about the 4 prongs that you need in terms of proving that a coach has been discriminated against. And I'll speak to the third prong with respect to Schramm's work. You can't legislate this normative standard. And that third prong oftentimes refers to an it factor. It's that hard factor to prove. They couldn't deal with the media. They couldn't raise funds. They couldn't deal with the boosters. They lacked leadership. It's that subjective factor that we always refer to. And what Schramm is simply saying, as Jeremy has said, we can't legislate that. It's too subjective to deal with. So initially, in terms of my thoughts with regard to Title VII, while I think it may motivate some decision makers to hire or at least interview more minority candidates, more needs to be done. And the difference between the...
It's tough.
But the problem that I see is that one thing that we have not considered, and we spoke a little bit about it earlier, but that we haven't fully considered, is what about the environment? What about the environment? You see, the difference, another difference between social work and sociology is also that we try and take into account human behavior in the social environment. So we have to take in consideration the environment. And let's look at the environment of college sports. Check this out. When we look at the demographics of athletic directors, 90% of athletic directors in Division I sports are white. When we look at the position of associate athletic director, 88.9% white. When we look at the assistant athletic director's position, 87.5% white. Even when we look at the senior women's administrator's position, 91% white. So when we think about this notion of social justice and mutual aid, not only do we have to design an intervention for our black coaches, but I would argue that we have to design an intervention for the athletic departments and the environment in which these black coaches have to operate. That would make sense. So, in terms of resolutions, I look at the work of Young. Young views true social justice as an institutional condition that enables participation and overcomes oppression and domination through the achievement of self-development and determination. So you say, oh, well, and my students call me Doc G. Well, Doc G, what does all this mean? What I would propose is this. I would propose to individuals like Charlotte Westerhouse and Coach Floyd Keith that we conduct some research. We know of 414 schools, minus the 21 hires. We know of about 390 schools that did not hire African-American coaches. So we should develop research where we go to these institutions and these individual decision makers confidentially can speak to us about the reasons that these black coaches did not get the jobs. They can tell us what they didn't have. They can tell us what they did have. They can tell us what they need to work on. They can look at themselves, and maybe there's a little bit of ethnocentrism involved. So we can conduct research on that level. Secondly, we can go to the black coaches. We can talk to them about their perception of their interviews, the interviewing process, the informal pipeline, what went right, what went wrong. In social work, we use our research. So my second recommendation would be to develop cultural competence training for athletic departments so that they can understand the socialization of black coaches.